So OGP, like I said this morning, it started in 2011, really as a conversation between some civil society leaders, together with some people in the White House in the US, that were thinking about the trends that we're seeing globally. The big growth of technology and all the opportunities it brings. The changing development paradigm, which was not so much anymore about accountability of governments to their donors, but more about governments to their citizens. Where concepts like good governance became a very clear concept of development and agendas, where emerging economies rose and rise to powers where the old powers were before, and that also changed the dynamic of the things people talk about and care about. So there was this whole discussion about what do we see in multi-stakeholder initiatives across the globe. They're more like the ITI. What do we see in the multilateral system, the UN system, and what can we learn from it, and what can we improve? So there was a lot of those discussions going on, and they came up with what now is OGP. And there are a couple of elements in there which are extremely important, and which we'll see back if we talk more about the basics. So one is, learning from all the other things that are there, is the importance of a true dialogue. Not a dialogue for the sake of it, but a real dialogue between government and civil society and actors in society about priorities. So that was one thing that people really wanted in the OGP model. The second one was, it had to be more than words. It had to be an internal, strong accountability mechanism, which obviously for the countries that were around the table was quite difficult, because do we really want to start a multi-stakeholder model where there's independent monitoring built in that we don't have a say about, which is difficult for government. So a number of these concepts that you will see back if we go to the details, you'll see. So let's go to the next slide. This one. No, one back. Sorry. Yeah. One further. One more. Yes, this one. Okay. So in the model there are 3 steps. I think we had, you've seen the brochure, you've heard people talk about OGP. There are 3 steps. I mentioned them this morning as well. There's a dialogue, there are concrete ambitious commitments, and there's independent monitoring. Now that's the core of it. But what do you need to make it work? So that's another way of looking at it, another frame if you want. And this comes from the OGP 4-year strategy, which basically says to make it work you need a couple of things. You need high-level political commitment. If there's not a champion on the government side, this is not going to work. We've seen it, for example, in a country like Croatia, where the Minister of Finance, I think it was a big champion of OGP, and their first plan was very much about finance, which felt very comfortable because the minister was such a big champion. He moved to a different ministry, and the whole process became difficult because his personal energy for this agenda was so important. 2 of the founding members of OGP are Indonesia and the UK. That's partly because in both countries, a very senior minister, in Indonesia, PATTIRO, and in the UK, Francis Mont, personally really believe in this agenda. So high-level political will is essential if you want to make this work. Second, to empower the civil servants in the system. Civil servants are citizens as well, so they partly share what you are fighting for. But you have to make sure that the ones you work with, again, believe in this, but also are empowered by the political leaders to actually work on this. If you don't have civil servants with a mandate to do it, it will be a very difficult process. The third one I already mentioned is accountability for results. So OGP has a couple of accountability mechanisms. One is the government has to do a self-assessment. So every year they have to say themselves, okay, how do we think we're doing? Another requirement is the independent report, and it's an independent monitoring report with a methodology which is the same for every country, but it builds in space for the local context, and the research is done by a local researcher. And that OGP report looks both at the process, how was the engagement with civil society going, did the country follow the guidelines OGP has for that dialogue, but also at the commitments. What did you promise as a country, and what did you deliver? And I think there's a very important thing in there. It's about what you promised as a country. OGP has a country action plan, so it's not a government plan, it's a country plan. It's your shared plan. I'll tell a bit more about the independent reporting later on, but we have an expert here, Malu Mangaz from the Philippines, who actually has been the Philippine researcher for the independent reporting mechanism. So for all the details and the nuts and bolts about that process, you can ask her. She's hiding behind the pillar over here, which is actually here. And then the fourth one is civil society engagement. And that is also a very difficult one to get right. Not just because not in every country the government is as open to a truly real dialogue with civil society. We get to what's important in the dialogue. But also because civil society has its own challenges to get coordinated. I mean, you see we have a full room here. For you to get coordinated around an open government agenda is a challenge in itself. You all have different mandates, different objectives, but they have to come together. You have to think about how you want to work together and what your priorities are going to be. Like I said this morning, you can't come to the government with a wish list of 150 asks. We've seen civil society do it in Chile, for example, in Brazil. Let me tell you, you're making a government very easy to ignore most of them and pick the ones they feel comfortable with. So it's difficult, but much more strategic to pick out the 5, 6, 7 things you really want, because it's more difficult for government to ignore them. And OGP asks, and I'll get to that as well, OGP asks for a dialogue, not just while you develop a plan, but also ongoing. This ongoing dialogue or permanent dialogue mechanism, I think might be the most important thing in OGP to get right. And how countries do it is very different, but it's a really, really important one to get right. And two things I think, we have the case of Indonesia here, we have more cases in our minds that we can talk about in the coming days, but that ongoing dialogue on a regular basis with the right people in the room is extremely important to get OGP right as well. Next slide, please. So this is where we are. So I think it's important to say that OGP, while in essence it's a national process, the dialogue you have with your government is the most important thing OGP has, but it gets part of its energy and its strength from the international level. Not just because other countries can bring you support, or you can learn from them. It's the other way around as well. They can learn from you. Not just because the international attention also brings an additional way for you to put pressure on your government to say, well, hey, this government is doing this, so why is it so difficult for us? We're talking about breakfast this morning. The Philippines still don't have an access to information law. Hopefully the president there gets a bit worried that 102 or 3 countries now have one, and a lot of countries around him are introducing ones recently, and he's still thinking about it. That international pressure can be something you play with as civil society. So this is the map of OGP, and I think 1 or 2 countries are missing. For example, Bosnia joined late last year. But the numbers are right. So 65 countries now. It started with 8, including Indonesia, the Philippines, South Africa, Brazil, so all these emerging economies are there, but also the US, the UK, Norway, some of the older democracies. And when they started it in 2011, I don't think they expected it to grow so fast. But there you have it. We have 65 countries. We have about 70, 75 different action plans now. 2,000 single open government reforms promised by these countries. So that's quite an achievement and quite a group of countries and civil society organizations you can work with, because that's not on here, the number of civil society organizations. But these 65 countries also means hundreds of civil society organizations involved at the national and the international level. Next slide, please. So that was a bit about the story of OGP. It really started with a handful of reformers sitting down and thinking about, in this climate where countries are opening up, whether it's the former communist countries in Europe, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's Myanmar, where technology gives a lot of opportunities, but at the same time there's the opposite trend, right, where civic space is being challenged, where a lot of countries are introducing NGO laws to make it more difficult for NGOs to operate. That's not just happening in countries where you would expect it, like Azerbaijan, but working in civil society is also not easy in countries like Indonesia or even the UK, where, for example, to give you an idea, they're introducing a law, we're discussing a law, which would forbid civil society to campaign around election time about the topics where the two main parties disagree. They don't want civil society to push, in that sense, to push for one party or the other. That's a worrying trend. So OGP is on the positive side of that trend, trying to create space for openness and responsive government. Moving to the nuts and bolts of what OGP is. Next slide, please. So how does it work? And these are the official steps, and you're basically in step 1, joining, becoming eligible. And we already heard just now a bit about the eligibility. We have a session after lunch fully about eligibility, so I won't go into the details now. But once you're eligible, how it works is that your government sends a letter to the chairs of OGP, which at the moment are South Africa and Mexico, together on civil society side with Sunita Kaimal of the National Resource Governance Institute and Alejandro Gonzalez from a Mexican NGO called GESOC. Those 4 are the chairs of OGP, and if your country is ready to join, eligible, they'll send a letter saying, okay, we're willing to become part of OGP, and with that, we also endorse the Declaration of Values and Principles that comes with it. And that's an important thing. I'll get back to that. And then you have that, okay, well, welcome, you're in OGP, what's next? Then the real work obviously starts, which is developing the first action plan. Developing any action plan is difficult, but the first one is really difficult because you have to really think about everything. And that's where the consultation starts. Government can't do this on its own. It has to have a broad and inclusive dialogue with civil society. Broad and inclusive dialogue. Not just with its friends, the ones it always wants to work with. Not just with umbrella organizations. A broad and inclusive dialogue. That's something else than the governance mechanism. And the governance mechanism, you can say we do it with a few organizations because we can't sit with 180. But the developing of an action plan has to be a very open process. And that is a very thorough dialogue, like we're having here in the coming days. This has to do about what do you want to prioritize? What are the things you want to put in the action plan? Where are you as a country already on open government? And what are the steps that you want to make? Now, you're not eligible yet, but these steps, this starting a dialogue with civil society, thinking about how you want to govern the process, thinking about what you want to put in the plan, you can already do now. You can have a plan before you actually join OGP, a plan about how you're going to join OGP and how you're going to make the first reforms. And that's actually, I think, something you actually should do. We've seen in other countries that, in a way, and we never thought of that at the beginning, in a way, countries that need a year or 2 years to become eligible before they actually join, in a way they have an advantage. Because you can already think about how you want to set up things and how you want to do things before you actually join. So you're ahead of the game. We've seen that in Ireland and Bosnia, for example, 2 other countries where civil society very strongly campaigned for membership, and it took them about a year and a half to get there. So let's co-create. Government and civil society and actors in society to co-create the country's plan. And then you have to implement it. And implement is not, I mean, you could see it as something the government does. So we talk while we develop a plan, and then the government has to implement it. That's one way of looking at it. You see a lot of countries where actually the implementation is something that's also done in partnership, where certain commitments are developed by government and civil society together. For example, if you talk about an access to information law, it might be very smart to create a team of government and civil society experts to work on that, and not just have civil society on the outside. So there are different ways of doing it, but I think some of the strongest countries we see with a small team of government and civil society around these commitments. The US, for example, has small teams around commitments that actually help with the implementation. Other ways of doing it, working on this implementation together. Some countries have plans where there are civil society commitments in there as well. So they're not just things the government has to do, there are also commitments in there of what civil society promises to do, or what Parliament promises to do. Because while the country plan, in essence, is a plan of the executive branch of your government, you can include commitments on transparency and accountability and participation of the judiciary or of Parliament. And there's a lot of support available in the implementation phase as well from the outside. I'll get to that, but it's not that every country has to do it on its own. I think one of the beauty parts of OGP is that there is support also at the government side. Because what I see is civil society in general is very well connected across borders. As a civil society organization, if you have a question with 2 emails, you can find an expert in a different country, in a different network. You know, we know how to find each other. That's much more difficult for civil servants to actually figure out who their counterpart is in the Indonesian government or the Philippine government. And OGP offers ways of making that a little bit easier for the civil servants. Then there's assess, we talked about it, so there's 2 official ways of assessing and a third one. The 2 official ways are self-assessment by government after 1 year and after 2 years, so action plans have a 2-year period. There's a small self-assessment after a year and there's a big one after 2 years. There's the independent reporting mechanism that does it from the outside with independent view of what happened, talking to government and civil society. And then obviously there's civil society monitoring as well, which looks different in every country, but there is civil society monitoring as well happening on the view of how civil society sees things are going. And interestingly enough, for example, a country like Mexico, they do the monitoring together. So the self-assessment by government is done actually by government and civil society, which is a very interesting way of looking at the partnership. And the final one on this slide is there's a lot of space for learning and exchange in OGP. It happens through the regional and international events, a regional event like the Bali meeting people referred to earlier today, last year, which is a place where actors, government, civil society, media, private sector come together. It's very informal, so it's a very easy way to get in touch with colleagues in your country and outside. But it's also a way to get inspiration and learning. Other ways are there's a lot of webinars around OGP, there's working groups, there's a role for the multilaterals. So if you need any knowledge or any exchange, it happens also between countries bilaterally. I know, for example, that the government of Georgia visited the government of Mexico because they wanted to learn from each other how we're dealing with access to information and how Georgia actually is taking another step in introducing proactive transparency, proactive disclosure of information. And they wanted to learn from each other how they were doing it. A similar type of exchange, not on access to information, unfortunately happened between Argentina and South Africa. They wanted to learn from each other about public service delivery and how you can make that more transparent. Next slide, please. So these are the famous eligibility criteria, which I can tell you was already a big negotiation at the beginning of OGP, because obviously the civil society organizations around the table wanted to make the threshold very high, and the government wanted to make it relatively low. And they came up with a compromise. So are the eligibility criteria perfect? No. Are they a seal of approval of the country of where it is on its openness agenda? No. It's just a way of seeing if a country has some basic steps in place that give an indication about its readiness to be ambitious about transparency and accountability. And I think what some countries, some civil society conflated with is a goal in itself. Yes, it is a goal in the sense that you have to meet the criteria to join OGP. But I think we should not get hung up too much on what's in the eligibility criteria. I've had many discussions with Toby about this. The eligibility criteria, in a way, I mean, you can see it as they're good enough to get in, but not good enough to stay in. It just means it's the first base, and after that, you have to show that on these areas that are in there, you're going to show a lot more ambition. And you can start with that now. So if you have a dialogue with your government on access to information, yes, they'll get the points, the 4 points, if they introduce an access to information law. But I wouldn't just ask them about an access to information law. I would ask them about allocating budget to implement it. I would ask them about information commissioners. I would build in asks that actually help you with the implementation as well. If you talk about fiscal transparency, I wouldn't just ask about these 2 documents that you need to get the 4 points, but I would ask for a whole range of things. Smartly pick, because I also said don't ask too many different things. So you have to think about it. But the main thing, I think, is the eligibility criteria is just a step in the process. And you have a long way to go. Some people say you have, the OECD, for example, says you have 2 points on asset disclosure. The World Bank database, which is the official source for it, still says that you have 0 points, so there's some clarification there needed. I think it's possible for Myanmar to join OGP in 2016. I think it's possible. The one thing that worries me here, we'll talk a bit more about it after lunch, is your score on citizen engagement, because the idea of partnership is so crucial and essential to OGP. And on that one, you also score 0 points. And that's a more complex one to get better at. We'll talk more about this after lunch. Next slide. So what can civil society do? How does it work? I think there's a role for civil society in each of these steps. And like I said, I think perhaps the most interesting one is now, when you're campaigning for eligibility, because the whole field is open. You can really design it how you want it. And you have the time to do it because you're not under time pressure to deliver the OGP action plan. You still have time to shape it how you want to shape it. And to organize a civil society, to be strategic and to pick your priorities. But that's where you can campaign. And civil society in Bosnia did it. Civil society in Ireland did it. In Ireland, civil society was very smart about it. They first asked government in one-to-one conversations. They didn't get an answer. Then they started asking them on Twitter, which worked very well in Ireland. And then government and parliamentarians felt obliged to respond. And they kept up with it, so government got interested. And they tweaked their argumentation to the things the government needed. Government and civil society are in this thing for different reasons. And that's fine. It's fine that for government it's a way to make bureaucracy more efficient, or to get a nice photo opportunity with President Obama, or to think that open data will revigorate the economy, and it's fine. As long as there's enough common ground where you can find each other as government and civil society on things you both want. So the phase around campaigning, you're all civil society organizations. You know what democracy is. So this is one where you're probably ready to go. You go one back? Yeah. Now further. The other direction. Forward. Let's see which one I want. This one I want. Sorry, they're a bit mixed up. So that's campaigning for eligibility. Then there's creating for an action plan. Well, like I said, again, a lot comes to coordination and prioritizing in civil society. You have a role in assisting in implementation, and I think, you know, we had the informal dinner with the Deputy Minister yesterday, and one thing which is really important in the whole thing is for you to figure out which role you want to play in which phase and how you want to organize that. And government has to be open to give you a place in all of these phases. But very important is that you as civil society decide who you want to have at the table. And hopefully in the afternoon we have time to discuss with your Indonesian colleagues, I think in the citizen engagement breakout. They've gone through a very interesting phase, and I think there are 2 lessons there that I want to share. One is the government there picked the initial 4 organizations they wanted to represent civil society. If you ask me, they picked the 4 logical ones, the 4 right ones, But the pure fact that it was the government picking them and not civil society selecting their own representatives led to a lot of discussion and delay on the civil society side of Indonesia. So an important lesson for your government and for you as civil society to ask for is, please give us the space to self-select our representatives, and we'll organize it on our own side, how we work together. And that's the second thing I hope the Indonesians will talk to about this afternoon, is about how they are now organized. I think they're very smartly organized. They have a rich and diverse civil society like we have here, and they organize themselves around themes and working groups, and the leaders of these working groups are then the ones sitting around the table with the government. So there's a role for you to play in each phase. Can I go back one slide? Back. Yes, so these are really important. And like I said, you can start now. You don't have to wait to the moment you're eligible. Because I think one thing you could consider is developing an action plan with the government to become eligible on the topics that you need for eligibility. Access to information, fiscal transparency, asset disclosure, and citizen engagement. Four pillars of open government. So you can already start. So what does OGP ask governments to do? These are the guidelines, and it's pretty straightforward. It's availability of the timeline. It's making clear beforehand what the process of consultation will look like. It's making sure everybody gets the information, so not just putting it on a website, but being more active about it, working with media, using social networks to get the word out. Thinking about how you want to document all the input, and this is for government, how you document what you get and how you're going to give feedback to it. This is one that was a long debate in the UK for their second action plan. Civil society was very structured in coming up with what they wanted. They had a long list of things they wanted. And the government, in the end, came up with a good action plan. I think the UK has a good action plan, but they didn't want to put in writing why some of the suggestions were not included. And that led to a long debate between government and civil society, because they said, well, if we really are going to trust you, you have to tell us openly, and not just tell us, but actually include in the action plan why you didn't include certain things, why you're not ready to include certain things, whether it's political will or technical capacity. There was a long negotiation, but in the end, the UK action plan actually does include the things that are not included. The government has been very transparent about why they didn't include certain things. And that's important for building a relationship and trust. So these are the guidelines that OGP follows, and that, again, are part of the independent monitoring. So your government will be assessed against these, if they meet it. And developing a good consultation is very difficult. And developing a good, real dialogue is very difficult, because you can treat each one of those as a box that you just have to tick. And OGP is not assessing that, it's assessing if you did it, not how well you did it. So that's the role for civil society, to make sure that the government really does this well. There's this document, I hope, that will be shared after the workshop. It's a guidance document where we explain in much more depth how you can do this and what this means, and how other countries have been doing it. Again, there's a lot of information available on how to really get this right. Next one, please. Yeah. So, to give you an idea, what do countries promise? Like I said, there's 65 members now. There are about 75 different action plans, around 2,000 commitments. And the thing that OGP says is there's a lot of space for context. We're not going to prescribe you what you have to put in the plan. There's freedom for you to have that dialogue nationally about what your priorities are. But there has to be at least about one of the 5 grand challenges that OGP has defined. The first one is public services, health, education, the things that, in a way, the government provides for you. The things where government comes really close to citizens, because these are the things you see daily. The second one is public integrity, which is all from corruption and anti-corruption to ethics, to how your politicians behave, asset disclosure, culture of the bureaucracy. The third one is public resources, knowing what the budget is, knowing what money the government receives from its resources and who gets it, what's paid by the companies. Being part of the discussion of where your budget goes, which is perhaps difficult at the national level, but very possible at the local level. You see a lot of interesting experiments of citizen involvement in budgeting in Brazil and the Philippines, for example. And these are three areas where a lot of governments actually are making commitments. And there are two grand challenges. I mentioned this to the Deputy Minister yesterday as well, where governments are a bit more reluctant to make promises. One is safer communities, which includes environmental threats, but which also includes transparency around the security sector, the military, the police. What are your rights? How many people are arrested by the police, and what happened to them, and what timeline, and transparency in the justice sector. A very difficult area for governments to open up. And the final one is corporate transparency, corporate accountability, which includes things like procurement. And those are the two areas where governments find it more difficult. Now, someone did the big task of actually tagging all these 2,000 commitments. And what came out is these are, I think this slide is based on the first round of action plans, so the first 1,000 commitments. And these are the topics that came out most. Open data, which was a trend. Still in the first wave of action plans, we saw a lot of countries promise to open up data sets they hold, which in itself is a very good thing. Creating an open data portal is not very difficult. Getting the first set of data in there is not very difficult. But to continue it and to get the government institutions to a point where they actually create data sets and release them, know what data they have, is very difficult. But it's a big area in OGP. Another one is a lot of promises around e-government. E-government is not always the same as open government. It can be, but it's not automatically. So for example, something like when I applied for a visa for Myanmar, it was a beautiful online process, very quick. But that's e-government, not open government, if you ask me. There are a lot of promises around citizen participation, opening up government, which is extremely important, especially also here, and fiscal transparency. So these are a few of the topics that come out in many action plans. But again, you have the space to create it how you want it. So if for you, and I've heard that a couple of times, if for you the issues are around land grabbing, gender inequality, the mining sector, media laws, then there's all the space to make a direction plan about that, as long as there's the political will to go there with you. Next, please. So some of the results so far. Is this working? Like I said in my opening words, no, it's not working everywhere. It's not working in every country. It's not working on every topic. Things have to come together, and OGP is young. It's only 3 years. So in that sense, again, you have an advantage that you join while other countries have made the beginner mistakes for you. But these are some of the results that I think are interesting. You really see big improvement in access to information in Brazil, for example, in Croatia and Georgia. Countries like Ghana and the Philippines are again discussing access to information. They're both not there yet, but it was a thing that was stuck for a long time. And at least 2 years ago, OGP gave the push to start the dialogue again. Again, you know, it has to be delivered, but the dialogue is back on track. Some countries joined the ITI. The numbers, I think, are very interesting. And 980 commitments in the first year. So these are the first about 50 countries that joined. 270 of them were completed on time, within a year. And you have to remember that about half of the commitments in these plans couldn't be delivered in a year because they had a time frame of longer than 1 year. 188, 24% of them were potentially transformative. That's a very important one. It's a subjective, in a way, assessment by the researcher in every country. But it says that the researcher looked at this commitment and thought, okay, this is not just an empty promise. This is really something that's potentially transformative. This is a good commitment that will make a difference. And 318 were really new. And that's an important one as well, because a lot of the comments we heard early on, especially from civil society, was, well, government just puts in the action plans what they already promised. True in some countries, but for me, ambition is not the same as new. Not always. Ambitious can be new. Ambitious can also be that you improve something you promised someone else before, or that you accelerate it. So ambitious can show itself in many ways. But many of these commitments were actually fully new. And then I also mentioned that before, some countries really introduced landmark reforms to become eligible. And that's one area where you can really learn from other countries. And Myanmar will have to do this, because if you're not going to release budget documents, open up asset information, and really improve on access to information, you're not going to be eligible. So you have to improve on these things, and on citizen engagement, obviously. One of the more interesting things, I think, is how countries organize their permanent dialogue mechanism. And let me take a moment to give 2 examples. So a permanent dialogue mechanism is actually the dialogue after you've developed the action plan. And every country does it differently. I told you about the US, where there's small teams of government and civil society that work together on actually implementing commitments. Then there is Georgia, where they really co-govern OGP together. It's government and civil society in a working group, meeting every month. 1 month the minister chairs, the next month civil society chairs. And so they really co-own OGP. They developed the consultation process together, they did the consultations together. So that's really a partnership in its true sense. In Ghana, they've gone for a slightly more formal approach. They have a steering committee, like the international level has a steering committee, with ministers in there, parliamentarians, multilaterals like the World Bank, but also a fair amount of civil society organizations. So they have a really broad range of actors that have the steering committee. Every country does it in its own way. And that's fine, as long as there is something that keeps the dialogue going, and you're not only meeting once every 2 years when an action plan has to be developed. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a bit in a summary, again, about what the countries promise. And these are the big promises. So 19 countries had substantial commitments, potentially transformative commitments or transformative commitments about citizens having a say on policy, so about citizen engagement and involving, opening up policy. 10 had really released a lot of data, open data. Kenya is one, the UK is one, the US is one, many more countries. 7 countries made big steps on the extractive industry, like the ITI. So these are some of the summary results. Next slide. So we're coming back to, so these were the nuts and bolts of OGP. And I don't know what the best moment is to take questions. This might be a moment where you want to do it at the end. After the, okay. Next slide, please. So we've been doing this for 3 years now. And so we're at this point where we can say, okay, this works, it doesn't work, we have to do more of this. So if you look at the 4-year strategy, 2014, 2018, what are we going to emphasize? One is to really deepen OGP, which means, and deepen has a number of aspects. One is that at the national level, for example, we've learned that it's important to involve a different set of institutions, not just one. Many countries, it's one institution that's responsible for OGP. What about the other ministries? What about the parliament? What about the legislature? So involving a broader range of institutions is part of that agenda, to get a bigger base, a broader base of reform. Another one is to really try to trigger countries to include a broader range of issues. So to tackle the issues that really are important. For example, in Latin America, this safer communities thing, this openness around the security sector is extremely important. We have to start the dialogue in including these commitments. Deepening also means more support for implementation. The growth of OGP initially was so fast that just getting the plans in place was already a challenge. We're now at the point where actually the support both nationally and internationally from the embassies, from the big international civil society organizations, from the multilaterals, from the working groups, is shaping up to really help the implementation at the national level. So that's all part of deepening. And then there are two places in the world, and in the brochure you got, there's a map of where OGP is active, and just by looking at the map you can see that two places where the challenge is not just deepening but also broadening the membership, which is Africa and which is Asia. Two places where a limited amount of countries have joined OGP and where there's a lot of potential for a platform like OGP to be effective for civil society. So those are some of the main areas we want to focus on the coming years. And you remember the slide in the beginning that the four big areas: accountability, civil servants, political will, and citizen engagement. Those are the areas we're really going to push at. We've heard from companies that there are two moments when political will is difficult. One is after the initial energy boost of joining. You have to make an effort to keep the political will. That's a moment we have to invest in. The second one is after elections. How do you deal with elections? You've just built your relationship with people in government, then elections come and you have to start again. Colleagues in Costa Rica on civil society side, for example, have been very smart about it. Before their elections started, they went and spoke to all the candidates, telling them about OGP and why the civil society they found is an important platform to be part of their toolbox. And with that guaranteeing that whoever won the elections was already on board for this agenda. So those are some of the things around political will. On civil servants, it's the same. I mean, Indonesia hopefully can tell a bit more about it today or tomorrow. They had a big ownership of the president's delivery unit, the previous president. The delivery unit in its form is not there anymore after the elections. So you have to reinvent, in a way, the ownership within government. And the advantage in Indonesia is that more ministries were already involved, like Bappenas, which means that there's a smoother transition. But still, as long as the base of OGP is a couple of true leading performers, we are at risk that the energy goes. But there's a lot of things there we have to do. For civil society, obviously, as always, the problem is capacity and resources. And OGP is not a grant maker, so we can't help you with resources, but we are very well connected. So if you're, for example, at a point in civil society where you've organized yourself, you know how you want to do it, you have the few people that want to lead it, then I'm convinced that directly or with our help, you'll find the resources to help you do it. There's not a lack of resources around the open government agenda. The challenge is making the connection with the funders and being complete enough about what you want. We're there to help you with that as well. Next slide, please. So this is a bit about the very ugly governance. So how does it work internationally? So I told you from the beginning there's been a dialogue between government and civil society. And it's not just a paper partnership between government and civil society. It's real. At the international level, there are 11 governments and 11 civil society representatives jointly leading this initiative. And that means that every decision is made by these 22 actors. And if they don't agree, they vote. There's chairs in there as well, so have a bit more power. Like I said, Mexico and South Africa, the chairs on the government side. There are also 2 chairs on the civil society side. And the 4 of them make decisions. But it's very important to know and to think about how you want to organize that at the national level. You can go for a steering committee model. You can have an official presidential decree about how you organize, like you did in Peru. You can have a more informal working group. Everything is fine as long as it gives you this ongoing dialogue and a real partnership. This afternoon in the citizen engagement session, one of the models I want to share is how you can organize partnership. We have 5 phases in it. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it's IEP 2. And they say, well, there's inform, where the government just tells the citizens what it's doing. They might put stuff on their website and then hope that people find it. And then it goes with very many steps. It goes to actually empower. So you can inform, you can involve, you can really consult, which is already difficult. You can collaborate, and you can empower. And over time, as a country, you want to go through these steps. And the UK, again, one of the most active countries in OGP, you see go through these steps. You see that the government is slowly getting to the point where they really, really want to bring civil society into the policy making, with all the challenges it has. But you have to get, over time, from just informing to via consultation to a real collaboration and empowerment. And that's going to be very difficult. And how you organize your governance mechanism is one of the ways of figuring out how to do it. Next slide. And on that, sorry, I can stay on this slide. On these steering committee members, in Asia there are currently 2 government steering committee members, Indonesia and the Philippines. It's not a coincidence that they're here in the room. And there's also 1 civil society steering committee member from Indonesia, Sugeng, who's not here unfortunately. But it shows also that in that sense, when the steering committee rotates again, I think there's place for a few more really strong candidates from Asia. So keep that in mind. So how does it, going back a bit further in how it works. So you have the big steering committee. How do they work? Well, you have the 4 people, 6 actually, 2 countries that chair OGP, the 2 civil society actors that chair OGP, and then the 1 country and the 1 civil society representative that chaired last year. So these 6 people together make up the governance and leadership committee. They are the daily management team, if you want, of OGP. They make the quick decisions. Then the second subcommittee is criteria and standards. Very important, especially in the beginning, because they were defining all these things about, okay, consultation, what do we ask for? Eligibility, what does it look for? How do we deal with a country that says, well, you're saying we're not eligible, but we think we actually are? How do you deal with countries that are not considered a country by every other country? Like Kosovo wants to join OGP, but is not recognized by all the countries in the partnership. That's all the role of criteria and standards. The very important one is they're also guarding these values and principles I was talking about. So that's an important question. Civil society very often asks, okay, I can see all the carrots that OGP gives, all the good things it brings, all the support, all the positive stuff, but what are the sticks? What if my country doesn't deliver? Well, it's a complex answer. There are a few sticks. But it is important to remember that OGP really tries to be on the positive side and actually assume the good intentions of the government. And if the government doesn't have the good intentions, then as civil society, obviously you can always try to convince them. You can ask us to help you. Diplomatic outreach sometimes behind the scenes really works. You can disengage if you really don't believe it anymore. But that's all sort of the options you have. What are the official OGP options? There are 3. There's 2, basically, when your country is not following the rules. One is it could be late with submitting an action plan or not following the overall timelines of submitting reports and other things. Malta and Turkey are 2 countries that are at that stage at the moment. They didn't follow the guidelines twice. You'll receive an official public letter that you're not doing that, and then you're asked by the steering committee to come and explain what you're doing. So that's one if you're not following the official guidance. The second one is independent progress reports. What if it has a section of recommendations in there? Another moment when you can get that letter, a public letter, which, governments don't like receiving a public letter that says they're not doing well. Again, if they're not following up the recommendations from the reports twice, then they will be asked to come to the steering committee and explain. But the most interesting one is a policy that the steering committee adopted last September, which is a policy on upholding the values and principles of OGP. And what that basically says is, if civil society or multilateral partners or steering committee members feel that member governments are really not living up to what OGP is about, even if they have some nice commitments about openness but are doing horrible things somewhere else, around openness or around civic space, that these actors can send a request for inquiry to OGP. And it's a brand new policy, so we don't know yet how it will play out. It's a policy to start with for this year. And I know that civil society in 2 countries is preparing such a letter to ask OGP to actually speak out about their countries and civic space in their countries. And how it works is that then criteria and standards, because that's what we were talking about, criteria and standards will look at the case and will first offer positive incentives. It will try to help the government of that specific country to improve civic space, to better its life, to explain what's happening and why it's happening. But that's phase 1. If that doesn't help, if after a couple of months there's still no improvement, then there's phase 2, where the steering committee can invite these countries to join one of the steering committee meetings and have an open dialogue about what's happening on civic space in that country. Now, countries won't like that, I can tell you. And what OGP can then do is make that country inactive, which is a polite way of saying you're not part of the club anymore. Now, that is the strongest carrot we have, and criteria and standards is responsible for it. Like I said, it's not been used yet. We'll see this year how it works. I know, for example, that EITI is struggling with the same thing. How to deal with Azerbaijan, for example, in the case of EITI, that are not living up to the rules of EITI according to civil society. And that country is now being assessed earlier than was intended. Might leave EITI, but I think it's important for civil society to engage in these processes as well. Someone was asking me over coffee, well, EITI isn't really working, so why should we join OGP? I don't think you have a choice as civil society. It's not either or. I mean, what we want as civil society is so complex, so difficult. I don't think we have a choice to ignore one tool and just use the other. You have to be outside protesting and advocating and being in difficult civil society. You have to be inside using platforms like EITI and OGP what you want. You have to use diplomatic pressure. You have to use the media. You need all of these tools to get what you actually want. And then the final subcommittee is peer learning and support, which is the one that in the coming years I think is going to be extremely important. This is where the working groups come in. Working groups are issue-based groups of civil society and governments really wanting to advance quicker than the rest, if you want, on certain topics. So there are working groups around fiscal transparency, around access to information, around parliamentary openness, private sector probably coming soon. So these are where the front runners are actually joining forces and offering their support to other countries to learn from each other and help. So peer learning and support is, I think, one that's going to become very important in the coming years. And then under it is the support unit, where I'm part of, which in a way is the daily secretariat of OGP. It's by now about 15 people that are responsible for this independent monitoring, that are responsible for helping the government understand and use OGP, and that are responsible for working with civil society to help and understand OGP. And one important thing here is that we were a very small team. I mean, up to September last year, the civil society team really was 2 people. In December, we've hired someone on civil society, strong civil society credentials to help civil society in Africa. And we're going to do the same with Asia. At the end of the week, we're going to post a position for a regional coordinator for Asia, based in Jakarta, who will help civil society in this region understand and use OGP and make the connections with other civil society, to funders, and to each other to make this work. Next slide, please. I think we've covered this one, so let's skip this one. So this is a bit more in detail, this idea of civil society engagement. So what does my team do? So the most important one is really working with civil society organizations in the country and understanding OGP and learning about OGP and making it possible to go to the OGP events, to have the conversations, to join working groups. This is the most important one, to come over to countries, to sit down, to coach, to strategically think with you. This is the key one we do. For the other ones is we develop advocacy tools. I was talking about guidelines about how to get better consultation in practice. That's one we have. The Open Gov Guide is a very important one. We'll share all these links and information afterwards. The Open Gov Guide is a civil society developed tool that basically gives you draft commitment on a range of topics. So if you say, well, we should talk about tax justice in Myanmar, and it tells you, well, these are the international organizations you can turn to, and these are the commitments you can actually copy and ask your country about to put in the action plan. So that type of tools is what we do. We're a listening post, so we're here to sort of, in all the 65 countries, to listen to civil society and say, well, this is working, this is not working, and bring these messages to the steering committee and say, well, really this has to improve. So these are some of the things we do, and civil society events, key civil society events, linked to the big OGP events. I don't know if some of you were in Bali. There was a civil society day before the actual regional meeting. Those are the events where we as civil society come together.